Imagine this. It's the middle of World War II, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and while everyone else is loading machine guns and checking their grenades, there's this one British officer polishing his medieval broadsword and waxing his longbow. I'm not making this up. While the Nazis were rolling through Europe with tanks and artillery, this absolute madman was out there fighting them with weapons that belonged in a museum. His name was Jack Churchill, and he didn't just carry these weapons for show. He used them. He killed enemy soldiers with arrows. He led charges into battle while playing bagpipes. He once captured 42 German soldiers armed with nothing but his sword, and somehow, against all logic and probability, he survived the entire war. This is the story of the most eccentric, fearless, and frankly insane warrior to ever fight in the 20th century. Jack Churchill was born in 1906 in what is now Sri Lanka, back when it was still called Ceylon and was part of the British Empire. His father was a civil engineer working in the colonial service, which meant young Jack grew up surrounded by adventure, exotic locations, and the kind of old-school British military culture that valued honor, tradition, and just a touch of theatrical flair. From an early age, it was clear this kid was different. While other children were playing with toy soldiers, Jack was already obsessed with medieval combat, archery, and anything that involved danger and adrenaline. He wasn't interested in the safe, predictable path. He wanted excitement, glory, and the chance to prove himself in the most dramatic way possible. When Jack was old enough, he did what many young men of his class did in those days. He joined the military. He attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, which was basically the Harvard of British military schools, except instead of learning economics, you learned how to lead men into battle and maintain a stiff upper lip while being shot at. Jack graduated in 1926 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. But here's where things get interesting. Jack didn't particularly love the peacetime military life. Garrison duty was boring. Drills were repetitive. There were no epic battles to fight, no enemies to vanquish, no opportunities for the kind of glorious heroism he dreamed about. So after serving for a few years in Burma, modern-day Myanmar, Jack made a decision that shocked his superiors. He resigned his commission. He just walked away from a promising military career because it wasn't exciting enough. Now you might think that leaving the army meant Jack was going to settle down and get a normal job. Absolutely not. This man spent the next several years doing the most random collection of activities you can imagine. He worked as a newspaper editor. He became a professional male model, which is hilarious to picture given what came later. He competed in motorcycle races. He learned to surf. But most importantly, he became obsessed with archery. Not just as a hobby, but as a serious competitive pursuit. Jack practiced constantly, honing his skills until he became one of the best archers in Britain. In fact, he was so good that he represented Great Britain in the World Archery Championships in 1939. Yes, the same year World War II started, Jack Churchill was off competing in archery tournaments. He also appeared in a Hollywood movie called The Thief of Baghdad as an extra, which just adds to the surreal nature of this man's life. But while Jack was living his best eccentric life, dark clouds were gathering over Europe. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party had risen to power in Germany, and they weren't content to stay within their own borders. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun, and suddenly the world needed soldiers again. And Jack Churchill, he couldn't sign up fast enough. This was the moment he'd been waiting for his entire life. Real combat, real danger, real enemies. The peacetime army had bored him to tears, but an actual shooting war, that was different, that was exciting. Jack immediately rejoined the army, and this time he was determined to fight on his own terms. When Jack reported for duty, he showed up with some unusual equipment. While his fellow officers were checking their service revolvers and making sure they had enough ammunition, Jack was carrying a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword and a longbow with a quiver full of arrows. His superiors thought he was joking. His fellow soldiers thought he'd lost his mind. But Jack was completely serious. He genuinely believed that a sword and bow were legitimate combat weapons, even in modern warfare. And here's the thing, he wasn't entirely wrong. In close-quarters combat, particularly in the chaos of a raid or an ambush, a sword could be just as effective as a gun, and it never ran out of ammunition. Plus, and this is important, Jack understood psychological warfare better than most people. The sight of a British officer charging at you with a medieval sword while screaming and playing bagpipes was absolutely terrifying. It wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about breaking their morale, making them think they were facing a complete lunatic who had no fear of death. Jack's first major action came in 1940 during the Battle of France. The German military had unleashed their blitzkrieg tactics, and the British Expeditionary Force was being pushed back toward the coast. It was chaos. The Nazis seemed unstoppable, rolling through France with their tanks and dive bombers, while the Allied forces scrambled to mount any kind of effective defense. Jack and his unit were part of the rearguard action, trying to slow down the German advance long enough for other British troops to evacuate from Dunkirk. During one engagement near a small French village, Jack's unit found themselves ambushed by a German patrol. The situation was desperate. They were outnumbered and caught in the open. Most soldiers would have either surrendered or been killed. But Jack Churchill wasn't most soldiers. Instead of taking cover and returning fire with his rifle, Jack calmly drew an arrow from his quiver, knocked it to his bowstring, took aim, and let it fly. The arrow struck a German sergeant in the chest, killing him instantly. This was, as far as anyone knows, the last confirmed kill with a longbow in military combat. Think about that for a second. In the middle of a 20th century war with machine guns and tanks and airplanes, Jack Churchill killed an enemy soldier with a weapon that had last been militarily relevant during the reign of Henry VIII. His fellow soldiers were stunned. The Germans were stunned. And Jack, he just knocked another arrow and kept fighting. That single moment established Jack's reputation. He wasn't just eccentric. He was legitimately dangerous, and he was willing to fight the Nazis with any weapon he could get his hands on. After the evacuation from France, Jack was assigned to the newly formed Commandos, which were elite special forces units designed for raids and unconventional warfare. This was perfect for Jack. The Commandos attracted the toughest, most aggressive soldiers in the British military, men who volunteered for dangerous missions behind enemy lines. The training was brutal. The casualty rates were high, and Jack Churchill absolutely loved it. He finally found his tribe, soldiers who valued courage, initiative, and a willingness to take insane risks. And even among this group of hardened warriors, Jack stood out. He insisted on bringing his sword and bow on every mission. He also learned to play the bagpipes, which he would play while marching into battle. According to Jack, any officer who went into action without his sword was improperly dressed. He genuinely believed this. In his mind, modern warfare hadn't made traditional weapons obsolete. It had just made them more surprising. In December 1941, Jack participated in Operation Archery, a commando raid on the German-occupied Norwegian island of Vågsø. The objective was to destroy German military installations, capture prisoners, and gather intelligence while showing the Norwegian resistance that Britain hadn't forgotten about them. Jack was second in command of one of the assault groups, and he approached the mission with his usual theatrical flair. As the landing craft approached the shore, Jack stood at the front playing the March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes while German bullets whizzed past his head. His men thought he'd completely lost it, but they also found his confidence infectious. If their commanding officer was calm enough to play music while being shot at, then maybe they could be brave too. That's leadership, just not the kind they taught at Sandhurst. The raid was intense. The commandos landed under heavy fire and had to fight their way through fortified German positions. Jack led from the front, as always, charging through the streets of Vågsø with his sword drawn. At one point, he and his men were pinned down by a German machine gun nest. While everyone else was taking cover and trying to figure out a plan, Jack simply stood up, threw a grenade at the German position, and then charged forward with his sword while the Germans were still reeling from the explosion. He killed several enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat before his men could even catch up with him. The Germans had no idea what to make of this maniac with a sword. They trained for fighting modern soldiers with modern weapons, not medieval warriors who seemed to have wandered in from a different century entirely. The Vogtsow raid was a success. The commandos destroyed numerous German installations, captured nearly 100 prisoners, and inflicted significant casualties. But more importantly, it proved that aggressive offensive action was possible even against an enemy as formidable as Nazi Germany. And Jack Churchill had been at the heart of the action, proving that his unorthodox methods actually worked in combat. After Vogtsow, Jack's reputation grew. Other commandos started calling him Fighting Jack Churchill or Mad Jack, and the nickname stuck. The British public, desperate for good news during the dark days of the war, loved stories about this eccentric officer who fought Nazis with medieval weapons. He became something of a folk hero, proof that British courage and eccentricity could triumph even against overwhelming odds. But Jack's most incredible exploit was still to come. In July 1943, he participated in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. This was a massive operation involving thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of troops. The goal was to knock Italy out of the war and open up a new front against Germany. Jack and his commandos were assigned to capture key positions along the coast and secure the beachhead for the main invasion force. As usual, Jack went into battle carrying his sword, his longbow, and his bagpipes. And as usual, everyone thought he was crazy. But then something happened that proved Jack Churchill wasn't just a lucky madman. He was a genuinely brilliant and fearless combat leader. Jack's unit was tasked with capturing a German fortification overlooking one of the invasion beaches. The position was heavily defended, with machine gun nests, artillery, and a garrison of experienced German soldiers. A frontal assault would have been suicidal, but Jack, being Jack, decided that surprise and audacity were better than careful planning. Under cover of darkness, he led a small team of commandos on an infiltration mission. They crawled through minefields, cut through barbed wire, and approached the German position without being detected. When they were close enough, Jack stood up, drew his sword, and charged directly at the Germans while yelling at the top of his lungs. His men followed, screaming and firing their weapons. The Germans, woken from sleep and confronted with what appeared to be a horde of sword-wielding maniacs, panicked. In the confusion of the night attack, Jack and his handful of men captured the entire position, taking 42 prisoners. Let me repeat that. Jack Churchill and a few commandos captured 42 German soldiers. The Germans later said they surrendered because they thought they were being attacked by a much larger force. They couldn't believe that such an aggressive assault could come from just a few men. That was Jack's genius. He understood that in combat, perception mattered as much as reality. But the war in Europe was far from over, and Jack's luck was about to run out. In May 1944, just weeks before D-Day, Jack was sent to Yugoslavia to assist the partisan forces fighting against the Germans. Yugoslavia was a nightmare combat zone, with multiple factions fighting each other as much as they fought the Nazis. The terrain was mountainous and hostile. Supply lines were non-existent. And the Germans were conducting brutal anti-partisan operations, burning villages and executing anyone suspected of resistance. Jack and a small British mission were embedded with the partisans on the island of Brack, trying to coordinate resistance activities. It was some of the most dangerous work of the entire war, operating behind enemy lines with minimal support. In the early hours of May 15th, the Germans launched a massive offensive against the partisan positions. They'd brought in overwhelming force, artillery, mortars, machine guns, and hundreds of infantry. The partisans fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Jack rallied the defenders, organizing a fighting retreat and trying to create enough chaos to allow some of the partisans to escape. At one point, he and a sergeant major were the only ones still fighting while everyone else had been killed or captured. Jack played his bagpipes one last time, a defiant gesture in the face of certain defeat, before a German mortar round exploded nearby. The blast knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he was a prisoner of war. Mad Jack Churchill, the man who'd fought through France, Norway, and Italy, the man who'd killed Nazis with arrows and swords, had finally been captured. You'd think this would be the end of his story. It absolutely wasn't. The Germans were initially confused about what to do with Jack. When they searched him, they found his sword, his bagpipes, and various other unusual items, but no identification that explained who he was or what he'd been doing in Yugoslavia. Because of his unconventional equipment and his presence behind enemy lines, the Germans suspected he might be related to Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. This wasn't true. They weren't related at all. They just happened to share a surname. But the Germans decided to play it safe. Instead of sending Jack to a regular POW camp, they transferred him to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp near Berlin that held special prisoners who the Nazis thought might have intelligence value or propaganda potential. This was incredibly dangerous. Sachsenhausen wasn't primarily a prisoner of war camp. It was a concentration camp where the Nazis imprisoned political prisoners, Jews, and others they considered enemies of the state. Thousands of people were murdered there. Jack was in serious trouble. But here's where Jack's personality became his greatest asset. He refused to be intimidated. Even as a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp, he maintained his sense of humor and his defiant attitude. He made friends with other prisoners. He organized entertainment evenings where prisoners would perform music and comedy, trying to maintain morale in the most horrible circumstances imaginable. And most importantly, he started planning his escape. Jack believed that it was every prisoner's duty to try to escape, not just to regain their own freedom, but to tie up enemy resources searching for them. In September 1944, after months of preparation, Jack and a Royal Air Force officer made their move. They managed to slip away from a work detail and made it through the camp's outer perimeter. For a brief, glorious moment, they were free. They walked through the German countryside, traveling at night and hiding during the day. They had no food, no maps, and only a vague idea of where they were going. Their goal was to reach the Baltic coast, where they hoped to steal a boat and sail to neutral Sweden. They made it about 20 miles before they were recaptured near the town of Rostock. Most prisoners would have been severely punished for an escape attempt, possibly even executed. But Jack's luck held. Instead of being shot, he was sent to a different camp in Austria called Sachsenhausen-Ossenliger, then finally to a POW camp in Tyrol. The Germans still weren't entirely sure who he was, which probably saved his life. If they'd known about his commando activities and the number of German soldiers he'd killed, things might have gone very differently. Jack spent the winter of 1944 and early 1945 in various POW camps, watching as Germany collapsed around him. The Allies were closing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. German supply lines were being bombed into oblivion. Food became scarce even for the guards, let alone the prisoners. But Jack never gave up. In April 1945, with the war clearly in its final days, Jack escaped again. This time there were no guards watching carefully. The German military was falling apart, with soldiers deserting and camps being abandoned as the guards fled from the advancing Allies. Jack simply walked out of the camp and started heading toward Italy. He figured the American lines were somewhere to the south, and if he kept walking, he'd eventually run into friendly forces. For several days, Jack wandered through the Alps, living off whatever food he could scavenge or steal. At one point he encountered a German military column, but they were so disorganized and demoralized that they didn't even stop him. They just assumed he was another displaced person in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Finally, after walking over 100 miles, Jack encountered an American armored unit. The American soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. a skinny British officer emerging from the mountains, still wearing the tattered remains of his uniform, carrying a walking stick he'd fashioned from a tree branch. When they asked him who he was and where he'd come from, Jack calmly explained that he'd escaped from a German POW camp and walked across the Alps. The Americans thought he was either lying or insane. But after they verified his identity, they realized they'd just picked up one of Britain's most decorated commandos. Jack was flown back to Britain, where he received a hero's welcome. He'd survived not just combat but months in Nazi captivity and 2 escape attempts. Most people would have been done with military service after an experience like that. But remember, this is Mad Jack Churchill we're talking about. The war in Europe was over, but the war against Japan was still raging in the Pacific. And Jack was furious that he'd missed the end of the fighting in Europe. According to him, if it wasn't for those damn Yanks, meaning the Americans, the war could have gone on for another 10 years. Yes, Jack Churchill was actually disappointed that the war had ended too soon. This gives you some sense of just how much this man loved combat. So what did Jack do? He volunteered to go fight in Burma against the Japanese. The British military, probably recognizing that they had a genuine warrior on their hands, assigned him to a commando unit heading to Southeast Asia. Jack was excited. A whole new theater of war, a different enemy, more opportunities for adventure and glory. He actually said that fighting the Japanese would be splendid. This man was truly one of a kind, but fate had other plans. While Jack was in training for the Burma campaign, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over, and Jack Churchill was absolutely gutted. He'd missed the end of the war. Again. After World War II ended, Jack faced the same problem he'd had after leaving the army in the 1930s. Peacetime military service was boring. There were no more battles to fight, no more enemies to vanquish. But the world was still a dangerous place, and Britain still had an empire to maintain. In 1946, Jack was sent to Palestine, which at the time was a British mandate that was rapidly descending into chaos. Jewish and Arab paramilitaries were fighting each other and attacking British forces, trying to push Britain out so they could establish their own states. It was a nasty, brutal conflict with terrorism, assassinations, and ambushes, and Jack was right in the middle of it. Jack served as a commanding officer in Jerusalem, trying to maintain order in a city that was tearing itself apart. He actually earned grudging respect from some of the Jewish paramilitary groups because he was fair and honorable in his dealings, even when he was arresting their members. There's a famous story about Jack encountering an illegal Jewish checkpoint. Instead of calling for backup or forcing his way through, Jack simply stood up in his vehicle and announced that he was a British officer going about his lawful duties, and that anyone who wanted to stop him should shoot him now. Otherwise, he was driving through. The checkpoint guards, apparently intimidated by this madman's sheer confidence, let him pass. That was Jack's style, pure audacity backed up by absolute fearlessness. Jack also served briefly in Australia as an instructor, teaching young soldiers about amphibious warfare and commando tactics. By all accounts, he was an excellent teacher, though his methods were considered a bit extreme even for military training. He believed that soldiers needed to be pushed to their absolute limits in training so they'd be prepared for the chaos and terror of real combat. Some of his students found him terrifying. Others found him inspiring. Nobody found him boring. But by the early 1950s, even Jack Churchill had to admit that his fighting days were over. He was in his mid-40s, which in military terms was ancient for someone doing frontline combat. His body bore the scars of years of warfare, injuries from explosions, bullet wounds, and the general wear and tear of being a commando. It was time to retire, for real this time. So Jack left the military and returned to civilian life. And just like after his first retirement, he refused to do anything boring. He didn't settle into a quiet life of golf and gardening. Instead, he became an instructor at a land-air warfare school, teaching military tactics. He took up surfing again and became one of the first people to surf the Severn Bore, a tidal wave that flows up the River Severn in England. He worked as an executive for a company manufacturing metal fabrications. He restored old steamboats. He basically kept finding new adventures and challenges right up until his death in 1996, at the age of 89. Now let's talk about what made Jack Churchill so remarkable, beyond just the obvious fact that he fought Nazis with a sword and bow. On the surface, Jack looks like a reckless adrenaline junkie who got lucky, and there's some truth to that. He absolutely loved danger in combat, and he took risks that would have gotten most people killed. But there was method to his madness. Jack understood something fundamental about warfare that many of his contemporaries didn't. Combat is as much psychological as it is physical. Modern military training focuses on technical proficiency, firepower, and tactics. All of that is important, but Jack recognized that in the chaos of actual battle, morale and leadership matter just as much as firepower. A terrified soldier with a machine gun is less effective than a brave soldier with a rifle. And an officer who leads from the front, who shows no fear, who plays bagpipes while bullets are flying, that kind of officer inspires his men to follow him anywhere. Jack's sword and bow weren't just weapons. They were symbols. They told his men that he was confident enough in his own abilities that he didn't need modern weapons. They told the enemy that they were facing someone so fearless, so unconcerned with death, that he'd bring a medieval weapon to a gunfight. In practical terms, Jack understood that most World War II combat happened at close range, in trenches, buildings, and forests where a sword could be just as effective as a gun in hand-to-hand fighting. And his archery skills meant he could kill silently, which was useful for raids and ambushes. So yes, his weapons were theatrical, but they were also tactical. Jack's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was obviously an incredibly brave and effective soldier. He earned the Distinguished Service Order and Bar, the Military Cross, and was mentioned in dispatches multiple times. He led successful operations against the Nazis and inspired the men under his command. On the other hand, war isn't a game, and Jack's attitude toward combat, his obvious enjoyment of violence and danger, makes some people uncomfortable. We like our war heroes to be reluctant warriors, people who fought because they had to, not because they wanted to. Jack Churchill was not that kind of hero. He loved war. He loved the excitement, the danger, the opportunity to prove himself. When peace came, he was genuinely disappointed. But maybe that attitude, as uncomfortable as it makes us, was exactly what Britain needed during World War II. The Nazis weren't going to be defeated by reluctant warriors. They were going to be defeated by people willing to take insane risks, to charge machine gun nests with swords, to walk through minefields because the mission demanded it. Jack Churchill embodied a kind of courage that's rare and valuable, even if it's also a bit disturbing. He was willing to die for his country and his cause, and he never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That's leadership, even if it comes wrapped in bagpipes and medieval weaponry. There's also something deeply human about Jack's story that resonates beyond just the spectacular facts. He was a man who refused to be confined by expectations or conventions. Society told him that modern warfare required modern weapons. He disagreed. The military told him that officers should lead from behind and manage their troops professionally. He led from the front with a sword. His superiors thought he was crazy. His enemies thought he was terrifying. His men thought he was the bravest officer they'd ever served under. And he just kept being himself, unapologetically eccentric, absolutely fearless, living life on his own terms, even when that meant bringing a longbow to World War II. In the decades since the war ended, Jack Churchill has become something of a legend. Stories about him get repeated and embellished, which is ironic because the true stories are already so unbelievable that they don't need embellishment. Some military historians dismiss him as a colorful footnote, an eccentric who got lucky. Others see him as embodying the very best qualities of the British commando spirit: courage, initiative, and a complete disregard for playing it safe. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Jack was brave, yes, but he was also lucky. He survived situations that killed thousands of other soldiers. He escaped from Nazi concentration camps when most prisoners had no hope of escape. He lived to be 89 after spending years in some of the most dangerous combat zones of the 20th century. What would Jack Churchill think if he could see the modern world, with its drone strikes and cyber warfare and soldiers fighting from thousands of miles away? He'd probably be appalled. Not because he was a pacifist, he absolutely wasn't, but because modern warfare has removed so much of the personal element, the face-to-face confrontation, the test of individual courage. Jack believed that warfare should be personal, that soldiers should look their enemies in the eye. His weapons forced him to do exactly that. You can't kill someone with a sword from a distance. You have to be close, close enough to see their face, close enough to smell their fear and your own. That kind of combat requires a different kind of courage than dropping bombs from altitude or firing missiles from ships. It's not better or worse, just different. And Jack thrived in it. The story of Mad Jack Churchill raises interesting questions about how we remember and celebrate warriors. In modern culture, we're ambivalent about military service. We honor veterans and thank them for their service, but we're also deeply uncomfortable with the reality of what military service entails, which is training people to be effective at violence. Jack Churchill doesn't fit neatly into our contemporary understanding of what a soldier should be. He wasn't traumatized by war. He didn't come home broken and struggling with PTSD. He loved combat, talked about it fondly, and was genuinely disappointed when the wars ended. That makes us uncomfortable because it challenges our assumptions about warfare being a tragic necessity rather than something anyone could actually enjoy. But in being uncomfortable, we might be missing something important about what Jack's story actually tells us. He wasn't a mindless killing machine. He was a man who found purpose and meaning in military service, who channeled his need for adventure and excitement into fighting against genuinely evil enemies. The Nazis were attempting genocide, conquering nations, and plunging the world into darkness. Fighting them wasn't morally ambiguous. It was necessary. And Jack Churchill threw himself into that fight with everything he had. His methods were unconventional, his personality was eccentric, but his courage was real, and his contribution to victory was significant. It's worth noting that after the war, Jack didn't become bitter or violent in civilian life. He didn't turn into a vigilante or struggle to adjust to peace. He found new adventures, new challenges, new ways to test himself that didn't involve killing people. He surfed. He restored boats. He taught. He lived a full, rich life for decades after the war ended. This suggests that his love of combat wasn't about bloodlust or violence for its own sake. It was about testing himself against extreme challenges, pushing his limits, and living life with intensity and purpose. War gave him an outlet for that drive. Peace required him to find different outlets, and he did. The practical lessons from Jack Churchill's life are actually pretty straightforward, even if the man himself was anything but ordinary. First, leadership matters. Jack's men followed him into suicidal situations because he never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. He was always first through the door, first over the wall, first into danger. That kind of leadership inspires loyalty and courage in others. Second, psychological warfare is real. Jack's theatrical approach to combat, his sword and bagpipes in complete disregard for danger, genuinely intimidated and confused his enemies. It gave him an edge that had nothing to do with firepower or tactics. Third, courage can be cultivated. Jack wasn't born fearless. He trained himself to be brave, to override his natural survival instincts, to walk into danger when everything in his body was screaming at him to run away. That's a teachable skill, not an innate quality. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, conventions exist to be challenged. The entire military establishment told Jack that his approach to warfare was wrong. Modern combat required modern weapons. Officers didn't charge into battle with swords. Nobody used bows in the 20th century. And Jack looked at all those rules and conventions and said, basically, watch me. He proved that unconventional approaches could work, that sometimes the old ways had merit, that surprising your enemy was worth more than following doctrine. This doesn't mean that all conventions should be abandoned. Some rules exist for good reasons. But Jack's willingness to question assumptions and try different approaches made him more effective, not less. There's a darker side to the mad Jack Churchill story that's worth acknowledging. War is hell, even when it's conducted by colorful characters with swords and bagpipes. People died because of Jack's actions. German soldiers who had their own families, their own stories, their own reasons for fighting were killed by his arrows and his sword. Some of those men were committed Nazis who believed in Hitler's evil ideology. But many were just conscripts doing what their country demanded of them, no different from Jack himself. The fact that Jack killed them with medieval weapons doesn't make their deaths any less tragic. War reduces human beings to enemies to be destroyed, and Jack Churchill was very good at destroying enemies. That's worth remembering even as we marvel at his courage and eccentricity. At the same time, we can't ignore the context. Jack was fighting Nazi Germany, a regime that was systematically murdering millions of people, that had started a war of conquest that would kill tens of millions more, that represented genuine evil by any reasonable moral standard. The soldiers fighting for the Allies, including Jack Churchill, were on the right side of that conflict. Their cause was just, even if the means were brutal. Jack's effectiveness as a warrior, his willingness to kill and risk being killed, directly contributed to the defeat of Nazism. That matters. His story can be both inspiring and troubling, heroic and disturbing, depending on how you look at it. Maybe the best way to understand Jack Churchill is as a reminder that real human beings are complex and contradictory, that heroes aren't perfect, and that courage comes in many forms. If you tried to make up a character like Jack Churchill for a movie or a novel, people would complain that it was unrealistic. Nobody would believe that a British officer actually fought World War II with a sword and a longbow, that he played bagpipes while charging into battle, that he captured 42 enemy soldiers basically by himself, that he escaped from a Nazi concentration camp and walked across the Alps. It's too much. It's too theatrical. It sounds like something from a comic book or a video game, not real history. And yet every single one of those things actually happened. Jack Churchill was real. The battles he fought were real. The enemies he killed were real. The risks he took were real. Sometimes reality is stranger and more dramatic than any fiction could be. The final chapter of Jack Churchill's life was, appropriately enough, lived on his own terms. He spent his retirement years in England, still looking for adventure and excitement wherever he could find them. He became something of a local celebrity, the old commando who'd fought Nazis with a sword. People would ask him about the war, and he'd tell stories, though he always downplayed his own heroism and praised the men he'd served with. He stayed physically active well into old age, surfing and sailing and staying busy. When he died in 1996, obituaries around the world celebrated his life and his extraordinary military career. The headlines all focused on the same amazing facts: the sword, the bow, the bagpipes, the escapes, the sheer audacity of the man. But what those obituaries sometimes missed was the deeper truth about Jack Churchill. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a man who refused to live a boring life, who insisted on living with passion and intensity and courage. He didn't accept the limitations that society tried to place on him. He didn't care that everyone thought his methods were crazy. He did what he believed was right, what made sense to him, what challenged him and excited him. And he did it so well, with such commitment and skill, that he forced the world to take him seriously. That's a lesson that goes far beyond military tactics or World War II history. It's a lesson about living authentically, about finding your purpose, about having the courage to be different even when everyone is telling you to conform. Jack Churchill lived through some of the darkest years in human history. He saw the worst that humanity was capable of, The Nazi death camps, the brutal warfare, the millions of dead. But he also represented some of the best qualities that humans possess: courage, determination, loyalty, and an unbreakable spirit. He faced death countless times and kept charging forward. He was captured by the Nazis and escaped. He was written off as crazy and proved everyone wrong. He lived to be 89 and died peacefully in his own country, surrounded by people who loved and admired him. In the end, Mad Jack Churchill won. He survived the war. He defeated his enemies. He lived a long, full, adventurous life. And he left behind a legacy that continues to inspire and amaze people decades after his death. So what can we take away from the story of the man who charged Nazis with a sword and a longbow? Maybe it's that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Maybe it's that leadership means being willing to take the risks you ask others to take. Maybe it's that sometimes the unconventional approach is the right approach, even when everyone says you're crazy. Or maybe it's just that life is too short to be boring, that if you're going to do something you might as well do it with style and passion and absolute commitment. Jack Churchill did everything in his life that way, from playing bagpipes under fire to surfing in his 70s. He was fully alive every moment, squeezing every drop of experience and adventure out of his time on Earth. Not many people can say that about their lives. Jack Churchill absolutely could. His story reminds us that individuals matter, that one person with enough courage and determination can make a real difference even in the middle of a global conflict involving millions of soldiers. Jack Churchill wasn't a general directing armies from behind a desk. He was a junior officer leading small units in desperate battles. But his actions inspired the men around him, intimidated his enemies, and contributed in real, measurable ways to the Allied victory. The German soldiers he killed weren't killed. The prisoners he captured provided intelligence. The positions he helped take opened the way for larger operations. One man with a sword made a difference in the largest war in human history. That's worth remembering in an age when we often feel powerless in the face of massive global forces. There will never be another Jack Churchill. The world has changed too much. Modern warfare with its drones and precision missiles and satellite surveillance doesn't leave room for eccentric officers charging into battle with medieval weapons. Military doctrine has become standardized across NATO and allied forces. Individual initiative is still valued, but within much stricter parameters than existed during World War II. The commandos that Jack served with were making up tactics as they went along, improvising, trying things that had never been attempted before. Today's special forces are incredibly professional and effective, but they operate within detailed standard operating procedures developed over decades. There's simply no space anymore for someone to show up with a longbow and say they're going to use it in combat. Health and safety regulations alone would prevent it, never mind the practical tactical considerations. But maybe that's exactly why Jack Churchill's story resonates so strongly today. We live in an age of increasing standardization, where algorithms optimize our choices and social media pushes us toward conformity. Standing out, being genuinely different, living according to your own values rather than society's expectations, all of that has become harder. Jack Churchill is a reminder that it's possible to be completely yourself, to ignore what everyone else thinks you should do, and not just survive but thrive. Yes, he did it in the extreme context of warfare, but the principle applies more broadly. He found what made him come alive, what gave his life meaning and purpose, and he pursued it with absolute dedication regardless of what anyone else thought. That's inspiring regardless of whether you have any interest in military history. The photographs of Jack Churchill that survive show a lean, intense man with a sharp gaze and a slight smile, like he's in on a joke that nobody else understands. In some pictures, he's holding his sword or his bow, looking simultaneously absurd and dangerous. In others, he's in full military dress uniform, decorated with medals, looking every inch the proper British officer. The contradiction between those two images, between the eccentric warrior and the professional soldier, captures something essential about who he was. He existed in the space between convention and chaos, between tradition and innovation, between sanity and madness. He made that space work for him when it would have destroyed most people. His fellow commandos, the men who actually fought alongside him, had mixed feelings about Mad Jack. Some of them thought he was brilliant, a natural leader who inspired them to accomplish impossible things. Others thought he was reckless, and that his theatrical approach to warfare put lives at unnecessary risk. Both perspectives were probably correct. Jack did inspire his men, and he did take risks that weren't always justified by the tactical situation. He was lucky that his gambles usually paid off. If they hadn't, if he'd gotten his men killed in some doomed charge, history would remember him very differently. The line between heroic and foolhardy often comes down to whether you survive. Jack survived, so he's a hero. It's worth acknowledging that element of chance in his story. But luck alone doesn't explain Jack Churchill. Plenty of brave soldiers got lucky and survived the war. What made Jack different was his absolute commitment to his own vision of what a warrior should be. He could have fought with conventional weapons. He was trained in their use and perfectly capable with rifles and pistols. But he chose not to because he believed, genuinely believed, that the old ways had merit, that tradition and honor and personal courage mattered more than firepower. This wasn't just eccentricity for its own sake. It was a deeply held philosophy about what warfare should be. Jack thought that modern weapons had made warfare too impersonal, too industrial, too divorced from individual human courage. His sword and bow were his way of bringing back the personal element, of making war about individual warriors facing each other rather than machines grinding up lives by the thousands. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, you have to respect the commitment. Jack didn't just talk about his beliefs, he lived them. He put his life on the line for them repeatedly. He was willing to die to prove that his approach worked. That level of commitment to one's principles is rare and valuable, even when the principles themselves are questionable. We live in an age of casual opinions and performative beliefs, where people change their stated values based on social pressure or convenience. Jack Churchill knew what he believed, and he never wavered from it, not when his superiors criticized him, not when his fellow soldiers thought he was crazy, not when common sense suggested he should leave the sword at home. That integrity, that absolute refusal to compromise on what he thought was right, is perhaps his most admirable quality. The final irony of Jack Churchill's life is that this man who loved warfare so much, who volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who was genuinely disappointed when the wars ended, spent more than 50 years living peacefully. He didn't become a mercenary. He didn't seek out other conflicts to involve himself in. He transitioned to civilian life and found ways to satisfy his need for adventure that didn't involve killing people. This suggests that Jack wasn't a psychopath or a mindless violence junkie. He was a product of his time and his culture, a man who channeled drives and urges that might have been destructive in other contexts into service for his country during a legitimate existential crisis. When that crisis ended, he adapted. He found new mountains to climb, metaphorically and literally. If Jack Churchill has a message for us today, from beyond the grave, it might be something like this. Life is short and death is certain, so you might as well do something interesting with the time you have. Don't let fear or convention or other people's opinions stop you from pursuing what makes you come alive. Be willing to look foolish. Be willing to fail. Be willing to stand alone if that's what it takes to be true to yourself. And when you find something worth fighting for, throw everything you have into that fight. Don't hold back. Don't play it safe. Don't wonder what might have been if only you'd been braver. Jack Churchill never wondered what might have been. He lived the life he wanted to live, fully and completely, with no regrets and no apologies. How many of us can say the same? His story also reminds us that history is made by individuals, by specific human beings making specific choices in specific moments. It's easy to think of World War II as this massive impersonal force, with millions of soldiers reduced to statistics and maps with arrows showing troop movements. But wars are won by individuals doing brave things in crucial moments. Jack Churchill and his handful of commandos capturing that German fortification in Sicily didn't change the entire course of the war, but it helped. It saved Allied lives. It contributed to the larger victory. Multiply that by thousands of similar small actions by thousands of brave individuals, and you get the Allied victory over Nazism. Jack was one piece of a massive puzzle, but every piece mattered. There's something deeply human and relatable about Jack's story despite its extraordinary nature. We all face situations where we have to choose between playing it safe and taking a risk, between following the crowd and standing out, between doing what's expected and doing what we believe is right. Jack consistently chose the harder path, the riskier path, the path that made him vulnerable to criticism and mockery. And it worked out for him, not because he was lucky, though luck helped, but because he was skilled and brave and committed. That's a lesson applicable far beyond military combat. In business, in relationships, in creative endeavors, in any aspect of life, there are moments when you have to decide whether to play it safe or go all in. Jack always went all in. That's why we remember him. The world that Jack Churchill grew up in, the British Empire at its height with its emphasis on honor and duty and military glory, is long gone. In some ways that's good. Empires are inherently exploitative, and the military culture that Jack was part of had plenty of problems. But something was lost too. That culture produced people who were willing to sacrifice everything for causes they believed in, who valued courage and duty above comfort and safety, who saw life as an adventure rather than something to be optimized for maximum security and minimum risk. Jack Churchill embodied those values taken to their absolute extreme. Whether those values are good or bad is debatable, but they produced a man who charged Nazis with a sword, and sometimes the world needs people crazy enough to do things like that. Mad Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He was buried with full military honors. Veterans from the various commando units he'd served with attended the funeral, old men remembering the fearless young officer who'd led them into battle. The obituaries celebrated his life and his extraordinary military career. And then, because that's how time works, the world moved on. New wars were fought. New heroes emerged. The generation that fought World War II began to pass away, taking their stories and memories with them. But Jack Churchill's story survives because it's too incredible to forget, because every generation needs reminders that courage is real, and individuals matter and life is meant to be lived boldly. If you take only one thing from Jack Churchill's story, let it be this: you are going to die. That's not morbid. It's just true. You have a limited time on this planet and you don't know how much time you have. Jack survived years of combat that killed millions of people, then lived peacefully for 5 more decades. He could have died at 25 with an arrow in his hand, charging a German machine gun nest. Instead, he died at 89, having surfed the Severn Bore and restored steamboats and lived a life that was rich and full and completely his own. You can't control when you die, but you can control how you live. You can choose to play it safe, to never take risks, to always do what's expected and approved. Or you can choose to be yourself, fully and unapologetically, to pursue what makes you come alive even if other people think you're crazy. Jack Churchill chose the second path. He brought a sword to a gunfight and made it work. He played bagpipes while people shot at him. He escaped from Nazi concentration camps. He surfed in his 70s. He lived. The lesson isn't that you should literally charge into danger with a sword. That would be stupid in virtually any modern context. The lesson is about the attitude, the approach to life, the refusal to be limited by what other people think is possible or appropriate or sane. Jack Churchill was called Mad Jack, and there was truth in that nickname. He was obsessive. He was reckless. He took risks that killed other people who tried the same things. But he was also brilliant and brave and completely, authentically himself. He found what he was meant to do, and he did it better than almost anyone else. That's not madness. That's clarity. That's purpose. That's what it looks like when someone figures out who they really are and then has the courage to be that person regardless of the cost.